All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on recent legislation and the startup landscape, a dive into the Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS and Science Act. My name is Kirsten Loita. I'm a partner here at Osage University Partners, and I lead up our university relations efforts. I'll be the moderator for our panel today. I'll have each of the people joining us introduce themselves, then I'll do a bit of housekeeping before we pass the baton to Mike on our panel to give us some background. So we'll go to the next slide just to show you who's on our panel today. And Mike, could you lead off our introductions today?
Sure. Happy to be here. I'm Mike Waring. I currently am serving as an advocacy consultant for Autumn, the Tech Transfer Association, which I know many of you are members of. Previous to that, I worked for 20 years for the University of Michigan in their Washington, D.C. office, and I had a particular focus as part of my work there on tech transfer, intellectual property issues, and that sort of thing. I worked in private industry before that, and I worked on Capitol Hill before that. So I've been a long-time person here in the Washington, D.C. area, over 40 years involved in public policy, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Thanks, Mike. Nabil?
Thanks, Kirsten. Hi, everyone. I'm Nabil Ullah, Senior Analyst here at OUP, where I support our investment team with sourcing new opportunities, conducting diligence, providing portfolio support. I joined OUP about 2 years ago now, and some of my other focuses include managing our wonderful database of university spinouts, as well as our Smartsheet platform and leading data analytics efforts across our firm. Before OUP, I was a financial analyst at Goldman Sachs for 2 years on the investment management side. Excited to be speaking to all of you today.
Thanks, Nabil. Barry.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Looking forward to the session. My name is Barry Johnson. I'm Division Director for the Division of Translational Impacts. That's a division within the new Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. I am 40 years into my career, which I find hard to believe sometimes, but I started in a large company, transitioned to a university, took some time off to do a startup company that I was one of the co-founders of, and am now in my second stint at the National Science Foundation. I was previously director of the Division of Industrial Innovation and Partnerships from 2015 to 2019, and I returned to NSF this past summer as division director for what we call TI, Translational Impacts. Delighted to be here.
Well, and we are so glad to have you, Barry, Nabil, and Mike, to talk about the IRA and the CHIPS and Science Act. We are just really excited to bring this presentation to you. It started in part because we were doing some of our own research into the area and what this could possibly mean for the startup companies that we've been looking at in our portfolio companies. So we're excited to talk with you about that. We'll go to the next slide and just do some of our housekeeping stuff. People always ask us about this. Where can we find the slides and recording of this presentation afterwards? Well, you can find it on our partner portal. For those of you who are at our technology transfer offices, this is a resource for you where you can find previous recordings of webinars, as well as a lot of information on technology transfer and startups at academic institutions. For others, you can find this eventually on our YouTube channel, and we will also be sending the actual decks to all of the people who registered for this webinar today. So you look for an email later this week for links to that. We'll go then to the next slide. We do encourage you to ask questions throughout this webinar as well. I'll talk about that in just a minute, but I do want to give a short intro on OUP for those of you who don't know us. We're a venture capital fund that partners with academic institutions to invest in their startup companies, typically by exercising participation rights that are available through their licenses. As part of this partnership, the institutions share in our profits and receive programmatic support on tech transfer and academic startups, such as the webinar today. We're now investing out of our fourth fund and have made over 130, invested in over 130 companies in all areas of deep science. And many of those companies have had successful exits either through IPOs or merger and acquisitions. And the next slide, if we go to that, shows some of the portfolio companies. So next slide. Some of the portfolio companies that we've invested in and kind of the breadth of areas that we look at for investing. So we will go to the next slide then, which is our agenda slide. But before I get to our agenda, I do want to mention that we do encourage people to ask questions throughout the webinar. I'll be moderating them and asking them of our panelists. as the subject allows. So use the Q&A tool on your toolbar to ask those questions. The easiest way for us to keep track of the questions that come in. Please don't use the chat. It's a much harder way for us to keep track of the questions. So we look forward to hearing that. We also received some questions beforehand that will be answered throughout the webinar today. So thanks for those of you who provided those ahead of time. So moving on to our agenda, first we'll start with kind of some background on the legislation and how it came to be. Mike will be providing us that. Then we'll move on to some information on the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the CHIPS and Science Act that Nabil had put together. And then Barry will be talking about NSF's implementation of the CHIPS and Science Act. So we'll move on to the next slide, and I think the slide after that. And Mike, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Kirsten, and thanks to everybody for being here today. I'm sure there are folks I know in the audience here, and I look forward to seeing you soon at the autumn meeting next month in Austin, where I'm sure many of you will be. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the legislative history of this over the last several years, how we came to where we are now and where this all started. And then we're going to talk about how it came to be through the legislative process. And then the appropriations issue, which is very important, particularly for CHIPS and Science, because how much money NSF spends on any of these new programs will determine their fate, obviously. And then we'll speak briefly about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a separate life of its own. So let me just start by talking a little bit about how this whole CHIPS and Science Act came to be. Probably about 3 years ago, there was discussions in the Senate about maybe doing a major science investment package that would increase the authorized levels for spending for research agencies. Now, the Congress, I should say, sets ceilings. They set limits on how much money can be spent on various programs throughout the federal government. So that's called an authorization. And they create new programs by doing that. But there, as we'll learn later on, it's actually the appropriations that are authorized, that are then approved by Congress, that actually fund the various projects and programs that they authorize. So there was discussion several years ago about what could we do to increase the ability to focus on particularly hot topics in science and that sort of thing. And so in the Senate, Democratic leader Schumer from New York and Senator Todd Young from Indiana took the lead, Republican and a Democrat, as most things in the Senate are. And then they got together with a group of tech transfer directors that was convened by the Autumn Board and by CEO Steve Cisalka to discuss what could be things that tech transfer could specifically be mentioned in the legislation. And these discussions got more serious in 2021 under that new Congress, led by Chairman Senator Maria Cantwell from state of Washington, who was the chairman of the Senate Commerce Science Committee. They also had some discussions with the House Science Committee, but their focus is really on a much narrower NSF reauthorization bill. Anyway, long story short, the Senate did like some of the ideas. They took up the legislation in the fall of 2021 and did pass quite a large bill. And it did pass with bipartisan support in the Senate. It did include a number of programs to help tech transfer, including direct federal grants to universities and to nonprofit research institutes to help create more commercialization, which of course is what Autumn had advocated for. In the spring of last year, the House committees put together their own version of the legislation, which was different than what the Senate had come up with, and they passed their own version soon thereafter. So then we were in a situation, we had two different bills. We were trying to go through some kind of a reconciliation or a conference between the two sides to try to negotiate something. There wasn't a lot of progress made. Then last summer in July, both sides came back with a revised bill that was a consensus of the two bills, a changed version. It did include a number of the tech transfer provisions from the Senate side that we had sought. And that version finally passed both the Senate and the House in early August and was signed by President Biden. Again, this is a bill that only authorizes spending. It didn't have any actual money itself in the legislation for tech transfer. So now we're on to the fight about appropriations. And so since neither the House or Senate had passed any of the 12 appropriation bills that they need to fund every year to fund the government, by September 30th, they did a continuing resolution to keep the government open until mid-December. But finally, right before the holidays left, they agreed on a large omnibus appropriation bill to fund all of the federal government, which included the science agencies. However, all the new money for NSF, unfortunately, was placed in a supplemental, which is a one-time section, which does not add to the base funding for NSF itself. So what does that mean? So now NSF, and I'm sure Barry will talk about this, is now being asked to start new programs, including the tech transfer programs, but not really certain about any money beyond the first year or so that it can use. They got $1 billion or so in new money, but it's only going to be one-time funding, and whether or not Congress approves more of that money remains to be seen. In addition, we've had the elections that happened last November, which of course now means the Republicans now control the House. And so I think reaching consensus on spending for 2024 and beyond is going to be quite difficult, as we've already seen a lot of the disagreements between the two parties about how to move forward. One of the hurdles we're already going to deal with this year, you're seeing all about, is this raising the debt ceiling, which is currently at $31.4 billion. The Treasury Department is already doing some creative accounting to work around this problem. And Speaker McCarthy and the House Republicans want spending cuts if we're going to raise the debt ceiling. And the White House is saying, no, we're not going to do that. So we'll see where that all plays out. But this is sort of a preview of the fight we're going to have about money, which we're going to have later this year in the Congress. So that's kind of the history of chips and science. Let's talk briefly about the Inflation Reduction Act. This is also known as budget reconciliation. It's a device that's used to fund programs by reorganizing the budget to achieve savings that can then be spent somewhere else. So that package ran about $790 billion, and it claims to reduce the net federal deficit by about $300 billion over the next 10 years. But on the spending side, it also includes a number of environmental tax credits and incentives, and it was signed into law by President Biden last August as well. So obviously this will create some new programs, but the funding in the future will obviously be the key to its implementation. So in summary, there are potentially lots of new opportunities for universities and others to tap into these new programs at NSF and elsewhere, but these are going to be tempered by how much new money is appropriated. It's going to be challenging, I think, for NSF, and Barry will speak to that, about how they can administer these programs when they have limits on how much they're going to be able to use this new money, and their desire to keep as much of this research going as they can, which is their main job, of course, is to fund research of all kinds across the government. So hopefully tech transfer offices and their government relations people will be needing to monitor these opportunities when they exist, and be prepared to move forward with applications when those applications are made available. So we'll be watching that very closely. I think we'll know more soon about that. I should also mention in passing that if anybody's going to be in Austin for the autumn meeting next month, we'll be doing a panel focused on government issues, and also how you as a tech transfer officer can work with your campus to advocate for the programs you care about. It'll be Monday at 11 o'clock, and I'll be moderating a panel with several government relations officials from universities, the provost of the University of Texas, Joe Allen, who you all know, who's an expert on Washington and helped write the Bayh-Dole Act. We'll be talking about all those things. I hope to see many of you down there in Austin next month. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn over to Nabil, who will talk more about the specifics of some of the programs in these pieces of legislation.
Thanks, Mike. So we can go to the next, thank you. So throughout 2022, you may have heard the term climate bill thrown around quite a bit. And as Mike mentioned, on August 16, 2022, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into effect, and that includes the climate bill. And this also represents a major shift in how the federal government acknowledges climate change. And that acknowledgement comes in the form of a whopping $386 billion in energy and climate spending over the next decade. So the IRA extends and expands on existing clean energy tax incentives, making dollar amounts larger and payment terms more favorable. And it also introduces a lot of new programs that we're going to discuss. And the hope is that these funds will incentivize businesses to invest in and produce clean energy, and encourage individuals like us to make purchases that will improve the energy efficiency of our daily lives. So the timing of this act is really important, and that's why I want to quickly comment on the charts shown here. In both charts, the green line represents deal count, and the blue bar represents total VC dollars invested. And the chart on the left is clearly an impressive upward trend. But the main punchline here is that the largest bar on the left chart is actually just 2008 when we zoom out. And the point here is that there's incredible interest in the space, and the IRA is now here to potentially sweeten the deal for the startup ecosystem. And as a side note, our Financing Trends webinar will be at some point in March. So if you're interested in more content like this, then make sure you register when the time comes. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this slide is to kind of level set with everyone. During this presentation, we're going to be talking about a lot of money that's allegedly being earmarked for the benefit of qualifying startups. And so before we get into those numbers, I did want to mention a company called Solyndra. You may have heard of it. And for those that aren't familiar, Solyndra manufactured a new type of solar panel that could basically be mounted in a special way and packed together. Essentially, it produced more electricity per rooftop than traditional solar. But the key ingredient to their innovation was actually the absence of a key ingredient for traditional solar panels, which is polysilicon, which at the time was expensive enough that you could potentially justify an alternative. In support of that innovation, Solyndra received over $500 million in government funding. And what happened next was both unpredictable and humbling, to say the least. The price of polysilicon dropped 90%, rendering Solyndra obsolete and paving the way for the competition instead. And so the story is a bit morbid, but it's real. And the key lesson to learn from Solyndra's fall from grace is that the availability and award of government funding can be very exciting, but it can't guarantee success when unpredictable market conditions create a fundamental flaw in a startup's business model. And so with that, we can go to the next slide, talk about the actual numbers. So there's a lot of words on the page here, but to orient the audience and put the IRA into perspective, we broke out the initiatives into 4 distinct verticals that we thought would be most relevant to the audience. And what I think most of you really care about is how these bullet points will support startups or even the research that goes on at your institutions. So rather than read all of these bullets, I thought it would be helpful to look at a key few. So within the energy production and emissions bucket, here we've got about $67 billion allocated, likely more, indicated by the plus there. You'll notice how specific many of these incentives are, but I think the broadest reaching for startups is going to be the $30 billion of production tax credits. If you're a developer of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, energy storage technologies, or critical minerals processing technologies. And then within the commercial residential energy efficiency bucket, we've got $10 billion plus, and there's a slew of consumer and commercial incentives, which besides the grant shown here, they basically boil down to creating easier customer traction for startups, because these downstream savings intend to make adoption of new technologies more feasible. And that equals more easily getting customers for startups that are looking to scale up in these industries. And then in the transportation bucket, we've got 29 billion plus, and I will, this is probably one that everyone is familiar with, but the EV tax credit. The Inflation Reduction Act is going to extend the $7,500 credit for new EV purchases. And it also introduced a new $4,000 credit for used EVs. And they also removed the cap on the credit, meaning they're not going to phase it out at certain levels of sales from the manufacturer. So you may, when Tesla was selling their EVs, you may have heard that, oh, the credit's running out. If you still want the credit, make sure you buy a vehicle now. That there's going to be no more of that. Basically, it's up for grabs for anyone. But the key thing I want to mention here is that the credit actually applies only to EVs assembled in North America. And after 2024, any EVs with battery components and critical materials produced by, quote unquote, in the legislation, a foreign entity of concern, which I think we all know means China, would no longer be eligible for the credit. This one is important for startups because we see a ton of innovation taking place on the battery side. And so if the big OEMs want to market the tax credits as part of the sales, like Tesla does on their website, for example, they need to make sure that the supply chain remain in North America, which essentially creates domestic opportunity for domestic startups. And so I think the discussion of domestic clauses naturally brings us to the next slide, where.
And actually, before you go there, I'm sorry, can we, there was a question, because so you answered the first part of this question that came in, which was defining the techs that fall under climate tech, which I think that was the last slide. But then particularly this person was wondering about small modular nuclear, for example, like would that fall under this, or where can people see a listing of actually what falls under the different areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're going to answer that question on a slide that's coming up where we highlight actually the specific Not all of the industries, but many of the industries that actually fall within these buckets. So I'm glad you asked the question because we're prepared to answer it.
Okay, great.
So before we get into that, just a quick note on the domestic clause side of the Inflation Reduction Act. U.S. preeminence has been at the heart of recent legislation for a long time, and the IRA is not without its share of domestic requirements. For example, the legislation makes it such that battery, solar, and wind components must be produced domestically in order to qualify for a new advanced manufacturing production tax credit. And what's significant is that the credit is estimated to represent up to 40% or more of the cost of solar panels, 20 to 50% for inverters, and 10 to 15% for batteries. And so that could be pretty big savings, but startups are going to have to weigh these credits against the likelihood of higher manufacturing costs in the US relative to wherever components are manufactured today. Additionally, facilities that use domestically produced components like steel, iron, or manufactured products will be eligible for a 10% bonus credit. Basically, what this means is, just as an easy example, if you're a solar panel manufacturer in the US and your facility uses US sourced steel, you can get a bonus credit. And so there are many other ways to get that credit, but that's just a quick and easy example. And then there are also two new credits that are incumbent on domestic requirements, like a clean energy production credit and also a new production tax credit for alternative clean fuels, like hydrogen, for example. So I know one of the biggest arguments to onshoring has always been the cost of doing business in the US. And with these new credits, it's clear the IRA is trying to help bridge the gap. And so, it's not all up for grabs. And again, startups will need to make sure they understand, the cost profile of running their business, certain parts of their business here versus wherever else. And so with that, we can take it to the next slide. So this is the slide that answers the previous question. I won't spend a ton of time here because the next two slides, I think, actually do a better job of explaining the bottom line benefit of the legislation. But basically, we wanted to give some examples of the industries within these verticals that may benefit. And the industries that we've placed a check mark next to are ones where we've actually seen a decent amount of university spin-out activities. So utility scale battery storage, fusion energy technologies, which also includes nuclear, electrolyzer manufacturers, carbon capture and sequestration, consumer and commercial lighting, battery manufacturers, alternative fuels, greener crop yield preservation. These are all areas that we've seen a lot of VC backing in, as well as a lot of university spin-out activity, and we've talked to a lot of these companies as well. So if we go to the next slide. So in the fourth bucket on the previous slide, we mentioned alternative building materials. And it just so happens that we have a perfect example in our portfolio. So Brimstone is a Caltech spin-out that develops carbon-free Portland cement in a world where traditional cement is responsible for up to 8% of global CO2 emissions. And so Brimstone's technology is relevant to the IRA under not one, but two programs, which could impact their bottom line. First, the company could see potential subsidies in the form of grants, rebates, or direct loans through a $5.8 billion program, which intends to reduce emissions from chemical, steel, and cement plants. And second, they could actually potentially secure federal contracts from a $5.7 billion allocation that federal agencies will have access to buy low carbon industrial materials for their transportation and building infrastructure projects. And curiously enough, just a tidbit here, the US is actually the fourth largest producer and consumer of cement and steel in the world. So that creates some real opportunity for companies like Brimstone. Kirsten, it looks like we have a question here.
Yes, so I was going to ask it in just actually at the end of this, but the question was, would that domestic steel credit be for things like racking systems for PV or steel and construction of factories? Would it count for that?
My understanding is it covers both. But I'm happy to go back to the various pieces of research I read to see if it mentions anything more specific than that.
Right. And we know the person who asked that question, we can follow up. So thanks.
So the next slide is going to be actually another great example in our portfolio. So one of the key incentives in the first bucket of the IRA funding was the carbon sequestration credit. And there was a lot of words smushed together on that slide, so it might have been easy to miss this, but an exciting new addition to that CO2 sequestration credit is that for the first time ever, there's going to be a direct air capture credit. And Verdox is one of our portfolio companies that's spun out of MIT. And wouldn't you believe it, they do direct air capture. And so Verdox is positioned to directly benefit from the new direct air capture credit, which is $180 per metric ton if facilities capture at least 1,000 metric tons. So what's important for startups in this space is it's especially important to note that the credit is directly correlated with scalability. So for startups, the more you can capture, the more you can earn. And it's great for the country because essentially it's better for the environment as well. Next slide, please. So I think the last two cases naturally bring us to this slide, which shows just a vast number of relevant university spinouts in the 4 buckets. All of these companies are still private, and there is just tons of opportunity to get behind some of these companies, especially with the IRA lowering some of the CapEx or OpEx hurdles for these companies. A company here I want to call out, actually 2 companies. One is Sila, who got, I hope I say their name right, who got $100 million of federal funding recently. And then there's Ascend Elements, who also got $480 million in government funding. And that was actually part of the infrastructure bill. So as you can see, there's some overlap across the various legislations out there. But as investors in the days before bills like this, we used to hear startups allude to needing the government to offset X, Y, or Z to the tune of $50 million, for example. And when they're presenting to us, and it almost felt mythical to hear that. But now we live in a world where it's in the realm of possibility that these startups can get their hands on real non-dilutive dollars. And that's great as they market themselves to investors, because that is actually attractive to us as we see investors.
And we do have one other question on the for this person is wondering if small scale distributed direct air capture would not benefit from.
Yeah, so it's possible that that direct air capture company, if could be eligible for some other benefits under the IRA, but when it comes to that specific direct air capture credit, it has to be 1,000 metric tons or more. So if you fall below that threshold, you are not going to be eligible for that credit, and they make it very clear in the legislation.
And I think we're going to move on to your last slide of the IRA, and then I'll ask the next question. So actually, sorry, just one that I will ask one more question of the IRA before you moved on to CHIPS and Science Act. It seems much of the bill is concerned with using tax credits. Tax credits can be more challenging to leverage than direct, debt or equity capital. Can you speak to the positives and negatives of tax credits for venture-backed startups? And I don't know if this is something that you feel that you have the expertise for answering, but thought I'd put it out there, and we could also follow up afterwards too.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I have a ton of expertise to answer the question, but what I can say is, at least on the tax credit side, it is, generally you're right. It is a little more challenging to leverage that than direct equity or debt, because it's not always straightforward how to actually secure that funding through the tax credits. And sometimes there are costs associated with being able to make sure you get them, like hiring a government consultant for a startup to make sure you're utilizing one, you meet the requirement, and 2, to actually facilitate getting the credit itself. So as venture investors, we would like to see, obviously, the latter and not the former, just because it's much easier to capture a bottom line impact when we're, evaluating a startup and thinking about, the hurdles associated with their business model. So I hope that answers some of the question, and happy to follow up with more details if helpful later on.
Great, thanks, Nabil. So let's move on to the CHIPS and Science Act, and that'll lead into Barry.
All right. So now, moving on to the CHIPS and Science Act, right before the IRA was signed. So the CHIPS and Science Act was signed on August 9th, August 9th. And the act directly directs nearly $280 billion in spending over the next decade to establish the U.S. as a leader in semiconductors and promote innovation. And so the name CHIPS Act sort of lends itself to semiconductors only. But what we're going to find out is how much this act actually impacts industries across the board, including many of the same industries mentioned in the IRA section of the presentation. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So similar to the previous section, I want to orient everyone to 3 distinct buckets that we've separated the CHIPS Act funding into. And the first is obvious, semiconductor manufacturing and chip production. This is what everyone thinks of when they think of the CHIPS Act. And this bucket is expected to see over $50 billion in funding directed towards building, expanding, and modernizing domestic facilities for semiconductor fabrication and assembly to actual semiconductor R&D. And it also includes a 25% tax credit, which is estimated to be worth about $24 billion over 5 years for investing in semiconductor manufacturing and processing equipment. But one of the key terms here mentioned is domestic. Again, U.S. preeminence continues to be a theme here. The purpose of this tax credit is to really help bridge the cost advantage gap of producing semiconductors overseas. And now let's get to what I think is actually the most impressive piece of the CHIPS Act, in my opinion. So over $150 billion, more than half of the CHIPS Act, is dedicated to research and development. And I think where I really want to focus your attention is the $81 billion authorized to invest in the NSF, and the $68 billion authorized to invest in the Department of Energy Office of Science for R&D that's performed by scientists at the Department of Energy, at national labs, at universities, and even private companies. So if we go to the next slide, we could talk more specifically about how those funding buckets might be relevant. And I'm sure Barry can speak more to the NSF piece here, but on this slide, there are a lot of areas within those R&D initiatives that are directly called out in the bill to be relevant. And as part of the NSF, the new Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partners is tasked with accelerating domestic development of national and economic security critical technologies. And that includes everything that's listed there. So that's things from artificial intelligence and quantum computing to clean water systems. And additionally, the bill also supports early stage research in other areas here mentioned, like fusion energy, nuclear physics, low emission steel. And those are all things that we heard in the IRA section as well. So the point here that I want to make is that there's some overlap in the industries that can benefit from both the IRA and the CHIPS Act. And I think what's clear is that the IRA offers more direct to bottom line support for startups, whereas the CHIPS Act is going to be a big driver of innovation with dollars specifically designated to research and development at national labs and universities. Next slide, please. So of course, this legislation also wouldn't be complete without its fair share of restrictions related to China. So the first piece here is from October 2022. It's not actually under the CHIPS Act. It's more of a blanket export control relevant to all semiconductor businesses, but it's still important. And so the Department of Commerce implemented a new control that restricts China's ability to purchase, advanced computing chips, supercomputers, and manufacturing advanced semiconductors, because those items and capabilities essentially can be used by China to produce advanced military systems and weapons. And the control also restricts U.S. people to support China-located semiconductor fabrication facilities without a license. And then the second piece here is directly correlated with the CHIPS Act. So this establishes a new outbound investment review process in the semiconductor industry. Basically, it makes it more difficult for semiconductor companies to invest in China. And if you are a semiconductor company that gets funding from the CHIPS Act, you're required to notify the Department of Commerce of any transactions involving semiconductor manufacturing capacity in China. And the kicker here is that the Department of Commerce reserves the right to approve, cancel, or block that transaction. So you're going to be at the mercy of the Department of Commerce when it comes to transactions involving China and semiconductors. And I think that's a good transition to the next slide. So one of our portfolio companies, Sci-Fi, which was spun out of Berkeley, they are the inventor and developer of customized and open source enabled semiconductors, which they call RISC-V. And so they're a perfect example of a company in the semiconductor space that can not only benefit from some of the $39 billion directed towards semiconductors, but also they're one that needs to be, they need to be aware and wary of the new rules related to China. We can go to the next slide. And so similar to the first section, I won't spend a ton of time here because the message is essentially the same as before, that the university startup ecosystem provides a ton of opportunity to access companies that are eligible for a slew of these government incentives. And some of the non-obvious winners actually of the CHIPS Act are companies like Commonwealth Fusion and Source and Boston Metal, who at first glance might seem irrelevant, but remember that most of the funding is going to R&D, and that R&D spending spans industries across climate tech and semiconductors alike. And so with that, I will pass it over to Barry, who may be able to shed some light on this legislation in action.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation and have just a few slides that I'll go through and hopefully convey some additional information. I thought, though, on this particular slide, I just wanted to point out one of my other responsibilities as I do chair the NSF CHIPS and Science Act Executive Steering Group. So that group is looking at things that we can do today, things that we can do in the future that are relevant to CHIPS and science. And so we're working hard with our colleagues in other federal agencies and working hard with our colleagues at the NSF on what we're going to do this fiscal year, plus what we're going to do in future fiscal years when it comes to CHIPS and science. The next slide, please. And so what I'd like to go through quickly is start with some, what I think is good news. Look at FY 2023 appropriations, and then I'll look specifically at the items that are in the CHIPS Act relevant to NSF. Talk a little bit about our approach for this current fiscal year, and talk about some example programs that we are lining up that can support CHIPS and that we hope can generate additional resources for the community in the R&D space, as well as in the education space. And so, as Mike pointed out, it's really important to keep in mind the difference between an authorization and an appropriation. Authorizations, as the name implies, authorize Congress, future Congresses, to allocate funding up to certain levels. But in order to actually get that money, an appropriation is necessary. And so the next slide will show some highlights of appropriations. And if you look at several key items here, as Mike pointed out, NSF's funding legislatively was actually approved in two pieces for this current fiscal year. Roughly $8.8 billion that was in the base budget, and another roughly $1 billion that was in supplemental. But NSF, in collaboration with our colleagues in the appropriations committees in Congress, is considering publicly that $9.5 billion is in that base NSF funding and $335 million is in that supplemental funding. And so I got permission to share this slide with you all. It's being shared publicly, but I think it's important to note that from NSF's perspective and with our colleagues in the appropriations process in Congress, we're considering that $9.5 billion to be our base. The president's request, just as a reminder, was $10.4 billion, so we didn't quite get there, but it's a 12% increase for NSF compared to the FY 2022 number of $8.8 billion. In addition, the CHIPS and Science Act appropriated over $11 billion to mostly the Department of Commerce for research and development activities. And so there's a lot of good news in these appropriation numbers. And so we're excited to be working with our budget this year. I wish I could tell you more about how that roughly $10 billion that NSF has in this fiscal year is going to be allocated. Unfortunately, we're just not in a position to state that publicly. As most of you know that are involved in the appropriations process, NSF's budget is actually 5 line items. There's a research and related activities line item. There's a major research equipment facilities line item. There's an education line item. There's AOAM, which is what we use to operate the foundation. And then there's the Office of the Inspector General. So those 5 line items come to NSF, and then the NSF leadership in collaboration with the legislation that has been passed determines how that money gets allocated. And that's the process that's ongoing right now, is to figure out how much of that is going to come to TIP, how much of it is going to go to other directorates within the foundation, and how much of it would be used in other categories of those 5 line items. So we'll let you know as soon as we know, but that's a work in progress right now. And so next slide, please.
So Barry, just one thing, because I have, hearing some of this just, on the side of what we do, et cetera, that's actually just really helpful for me to hear. And I think it may be helpful for other people here about TIPS, because we hear a lot about TIPS and what it possibly, what it can do for the world of innovation and technology transfer and startups, et cetera. But to hear that, okay, the CHIPS and Science Act may be part of what funds part of the TIPS programs, but there are other sources of funding then coming in for TIPS as well. So just sometimes understanding how these all interplay with each other is very helpful. So,
and it's a great comment and question. For example, if you look at our small business innovation research and small business technology transfer programs, those programs budgets scale in accordance with the overall research and related activities number at NSF. So, we have a 12% increase overall for NSF, and it may not be precisely that, but you would expect that you'd see a 12% increase in the SBIR and STTR budgets for NSF. And so that is important because that's where we start, and that's where we fund startups. It would be natural to expect that we might see increases in some of the other programs related to that as well. And so I'm happy to answer questions about that. We can talk about that in more detail as we go through. I do want to highlight specifically the provisions that are in CHIPS for TIP. First of all, NSF actually created and publicly announced TIP back in the March timeframe, but the legislation, the CHIPS Act, actually establishes officially the directorate and defines the purposes and the activities. And you can see those. Our goal is to support, in fact, I like to think of it as kind of the 3 A's. We're going to advance critical technologies, and I'll show you those critical technologies on the next slide. We're going to accelerate the translation of basic research into societal impact, and we're going to address societal needs. Those are kind of the 3 A's: advance, accelerate, and address, that we're going to be focused on within the TIP directorate. The legislation also defines the initial list of societal, national, and geostrategic challenges that we are to focus on. And you can see it's national security, manufacturing, industrial productivity, workforce development, and so forth. And so those are our societal impacts that we are focused on initially. There's also in the legislation an initial list of key technology areas. I'll show you those on the next slide. But before we go to that, I do want to point out the multiple programs that were authorized by the CHIPS legislation. The legislation itself did not appropriate funding for these, but our Regional Innovation Engines program, which we've already launched, translation accelerators, test beds, entrepreneurial fellowships, and scholarships and other fellowships are activities that are authorized in this bill, and that we have in many cases already used other sources of funding that we have to launch these activities. In fact, if you followed the Regional Innovation Engines, you know that solicitations are out on the street and proposals have been coming in for both phase 1 or type 1 and type 2 regional innovation engines. We also launched, as you'll see a little bit later on, an entrepreneurial fellowships program, and we continue to grow scholarships and other fellowships. So next slide, please.
And can I just ask another question before you move on to the next slide? Because I know a bunch of the universities who are probably on this call have, been working on these regional and innovation engines, et cetera. What happens next with regards to funding for those? I understand now from you that there is other funding perhaps that has been used to fund some of that so far, but what's the process going forward?
Well, the process going forward is that, first of all, the solicitation was published, last year, essentially, and type 1 proposals, which are essentially planning grants for the regional innovation engines, those have been submitted. Those are under review, and we expect to have decisions here soon on awards that would be made for the planning grants for regional innovation engines. The type 2 engines were organizations, communities, partnerships that felt they were ready to be a full-blown engine. Those proposals have come in as well, and the review process will be initiated. And we do expect to fund engines. We expect to fund planning grants. We expect to fund full-blown engines this fiscal year, or certainly early next fiscal year.
Thank you.
So the initial list of key technologies, I won't spend a lot of time on this. I don't think this would surprise anyone, but artificial intelligence, high-performance computing, quantum, robotics, and so forth, these are the key technology focus areas. When I mentioned that TIP is instructed to advance critical technologies, this is the list that we are instructed to advance. There's also a directive in this legislation for us to evaluate this list on an ongoing basis and make modifications as needed and deemed appropriate as we move forward. Next slide, please. So what is our approach to CHIPS? And specifically, what is our approach for FY 2023? First of all, we want to leverage existing programs. We have a number of activities ongoing. I'll show you some of those in a subsequent slide that are focused on semiconductor technology, both from an education perspective as well as from an R&D perspective. And so we want to leverage those existing programs and put more resources into those existing programs so that we can immediately move forward this fiscal year with activities that are in support of the CHIPS Plus Science Act. We want to expand fellowships by engaging both community colleges and minority-serving institutions, as well as four-year institutions and graduate programs. And again, you'll see some examples of that as well. We're going to grow our research in the future of semiconductors and support many graduate students, obviously, in that respect. And then we're going to be doubling down on public and private partnerships. I'll show you a couple of examples of that in just a moment. But we want to use these partnerships to advance semiconductor research and workforce development. These partnerships will be with other federal agencies, other organizations, private corporations, for example, as well as foundations and others that will be engaged. And you're already beginning to see some of that in some of the announcements that we've made very recently. So again, our starting point is, what are we currently doing that we can grow? And then in parallel with that, we're looking at what do we want to do in the future and what new programs do we want to announce to actually advance the goals stated in the CHIPS and Science Act. Next slide, please. So these are some examples. We've identified 7 education and workforce programs that are going to be a focal point for this fiscal year in terms of collaborations with other entities, as well as trying to grow these programs. And I don't have time to go through these in all the details, but a couple of key points that I want to make. One is that obviously this is a subset of everything that we do, but what we've tried to do is to say, from those, dozens of programs that we do, what are the top 5 to 7 priorities that we're going to focus on this fiscal year to try to grow the investments that we're making. Advanced Technological Education is a technician training program that works very closely with community colleges as well as others to develop technicians that have the skills that are needed, not only in semiconductor space, but in other spaces as well. Scholarships for STEM, we want to grow that particular program that invests in low-income students, and you can see some of the contributions or investments that we've made thus far. Research experiences for undergraduates. We do have REU programs that are focused on semiconductor technology. We want to grow those programs. A program called Intern. Intern actually funds universities to allow NSF-supported graduate students to go off and do a 6-month internship. You can actually apply for up to 2 of these and make it a 12-month internship. And that internship can be in industry. It could be in a government research lab. It could be in a not-for-profit research organization. The goal there is to help prepare graduate students for non-academic careers. Just as a data point, 76% of the PhDs in engineering that graduated most recently went to work in a non-academic career. It's only about 11% that went into an academic career. Most go into industry or other disciplines, and so we want to be able to support them. We have other fellowships that are focused on just growing the base of capabilities in computer science, electrical engineering, math and physical sciences, and so forth. And then again, I'm not going to be able to go through all of these. I do want to highlight 2 other things. We are providing supplements to universities for semiconductor fabrication and prototyping, so that they can actually implement prototypes of the research and educational projects that they're conducting. And then finally, a brand new program that we just announced recently called Excellent. This is experiential learning in emerging and novel technologies. This invests in practical experiences. So there must be a paid internship or experience in industry or other locations that's a part of the students that are engaged in this particular program. Next slide, please.
Can I ask just one question then about those programs? Is to me, some of what you indicated, and because we're obviously focused on startups, can some of those internships or other types of things be associated with either someone working part-time at a startup company or working for those 6 months for the startup company, or helping actually get a startup company off the ground, getting paid to have that startup company get off the ground?
Absolutely. We have one of the programs that I'll show you on a subsequent slide that we launched this past year is with an organization called Activate. We're actually funding 2-year fellowships, for lack of a better term. They're entrepreneurial fellowships, and this provides up to $350,000 for the fellow in that case to go spend 2 years in an environment where they can incubate their startup idea. This might be in a government lab, it might be elsewhere, but the point is to give them the resources that they can be paid a stipend, but also have resources to support their idea. That's intended to be pre-startup formation, but it's to help them get to the point that they can actually start the company and get it off the ground. So that's a program that's very, very new. We also, it's not very well known, actually. We actually have a postdoc program where we fund postdocs to go work in a startup that's part of our SBIR and STTR portfolio. So those are also 2-year postdoc positions that are supported to get that postdoc immersed into a startup environment and community.
Great, thanks. And then I do have one other question, Barry, and I know we only have 5 minutes left, but do students who participate in I-Corps who apply for these internships, can they apply for these internships even if their research was not funded by NSF?
The intern program specifically is for students that are funded by NSF. And so it's a supplemental award that goes to the basic research award that's supporting that student. So it's really focused on NSF supported graduates.
That one is NSF. Okay, great. Yes. That's great.
And then again, in the interest of time, I'll quickly go through this slide, but these are the research programs that we have identified and will grow as part of the CHIPS Plus Science Initiative. At the center of this is our Future of Semiconductors program, and this is focused on co-design of future semiconductors, being able to look at not only the materials and devices, but the systems that these semiconductors are going to be integrated into, driving from the top down to generate new requirements for materials, but driving from the bottom up to generate new capabilities for devices and systems that are semiconductor devices and systems. So I'll be happy to answer questions about this, but in the interest of time, I'll move to the next slide. By the way, one comment, we can keep it on this slide, but just one comment, as you notice that the quantum institutes and the AI institutes were a part of that. What we're looking at there is for those institutes to be able to drive requirements for the semiconductor industry so that we can develop the next generation of semiconductors based on unique requirements that artificial intelligence or quantum might be stimulating. And so my last slide is really how have we been ramping up TIP? And there are a couple of things. I won't talk about all of these, but I do want to highlight a couple of them. One is that back in January, we announced a partnership with Intel that is going to focus on workforce development for the semiconductor industry. Subsequent to that, we announced a partnership with Micron, similarly focused on the semiconductor workforce activities. We also have announced just recently, January 10th, a collaboration with Noble Reach Emerge that's initially focused on biotechnology, but this is one of the first times where NSF is going to be proactively looking at the basic research we fund in biotechnology and trying to identify that research that is ripe for translation, and then support those teams that are identified to help them figure out what do they need to do to translate out, how do they go about that, how do they go about forming a startup company, and providing them the resources to help them through that process. The other point I'll make here is I think probably the people on the call know is that we did award 5 new I-Corps hubs this past year, so we now have 10 hubs that include 94 universities in those 10 hubs. And so we are doubling down our investment in I-Corps as a mechanism for helping faculty and students align their idea with market need and to create that type of an alignment. So I know we're out of time.
We're just about at time. Actually, Mike has a question for you in a comment. So.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. It's very helpful. Quick comment is that obviously, I don't know if you were going to mention this in any additional comments, Barry, but there's also new programs authorized in the bill that would allow NSF to actually provide direct grants to tech transfer offices to hire people, to improve their technology, to do collaborations, to educate and train people. Yes. I don't know if that's any of the part that you're going to talk about here. The other question I have is, you mentioned this base and also this additional supplemental money. Normally, when Congress appropriates money, the agency is expected to spend it during that fiscal year. But supplemental money, is my understanding, has a longer shelf life. Is there an opportunity if NSF doesn't spend all that money in 23 that it might be able to carry over some of that money to fiscal 24?
Yeah, it's 2-year money. And so that money is 2-year money. In fact, almost all of NSF's money is 2-year money. We don't like to carry over because, carrying something over, you do run the risk of losing it in that subsequent year. But almost all of NSF's money is technically 2-year money, but we're very reluctant to carry it over. To your question about tech transfer and helping tech transfer offices, I would simply say, keep your eyes and ears open. we are actively working on ideas there, and just keep your eyes and ears open for something coming forward there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you both. I have one more question, but I know a lot of people need to go because we're at the hour. We did put a survey link into the chat. You'll also see as you leave, so please do answer our survey and let us know about future topics you'd be interested in, how this worked for today, suggestions for us to how to do things even better in the future, because I'm very appreciative that we had such experienced people with us today talking about this subject of recent legislation. Barry, one of the questions that had come in and came in a couple different ways beforehand is how can, we work with tech transfer offices. There are a lot of tech transfer offices on. There are also entrepreneurs and innovators, on this. How can this community help you and help NSF and help driving this forward in the future?
I think there are a lot of things. And by the way, I encourage you, reach out to me. I mean, if anybody out there that's listening in would like to have a chance to chat or learn more, please send me an email. Be happy to talk with you. I think there are several things. One is that we are really looking to the community to help us understand the needs of the community. So what are the pain points? What are the critical things that you really need help with to advance commercialization of the basic research that universities conduct? So we're all ears when it comes to listening and learning and hopefully getting input from the community on that. So that's one thing that's really important. The second thing that's really important, as you know, I mean, this is a little maybe blunt of me to say. I mean, NSF doesn't do anything. We distribute money to support others to do those things. So when we talk about advancing research and advancing workforce, we're talking about funding organizations to do those activities. Unlike some of the DOE labs and DOD labs that actually do research and do things of that sort, we are a funding agency. And so in that light, please just keep your eyes and ears open for opportunities and participate in those opportunities. We want to grow the opportunities for supporting translational research. We want to grow the opportunities to support startups. And given that we put billions of dollars every year into universities, that's a primary target for us. We want to get more out of that investment for the benefit of our nation and our taxpayers. And so, your audience is our audience, and we want them to take advantage of these programs.
Well, I think that's a very nice way to end it for today. Mike, Nabil, Barry, thank you so much for joining us. I know we had a very broad topic that we tried to cover today, which is the recent legislation, how it affects startups, how it affects innovation, et cetera. But it's all about innovation, obviously, and driving that innovation forward. So thank you all for joining us today. There were a couple of follow-up questions that I'm going to direct to each of you regarding your areas of expertise. But we really appreciate you being here today. We also thank our audience for sticking with us for a little bit over time today on this very important discussion. So everyone have a terrific day, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.